Okay, so given that we didn't have a projector today, I thought I'll upload a couple of videos that basically go through the parts that can be difficult to understand or that might need some demonstration. And the first part here is AJAX and CORS, which are quite important to understand. So I'll start with those. So traditionally, when you do an HTTP request, you get back the resource that you required, for example, an HTML document, but then this is what you have. And you have some options with JavaScript, for example, to make this dynamic. For example, if you click a button, you can change your DOM tree, you can display an alert message or so on, but the tricky part is what to do when you actually need to get new data. So for example, when you click a button to load certain things that you get from your endpoint, then how do you do this? And the way to solve this problem is called AJAX, which stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And this is more a historical name because back then people exchanged data in XML, but it basically means doing asynchronous things with JavaScript and getting something back. So that could be text, JSON, or so on. And the cool thing about it is that basically it means that you can make HTTP requests within your page. So while the page has been served and you're doing other things, the user is reading something, you can update the page with new data that you get through a HTTP request in the background, basically. And that means you can have a website where you only load whatever is needed, for example, some kind of introduction text and so on. And then whenever the user does something, for example, logs in or provides some new information, you can load new things in the background. And the JavaScript way to do that is to use the XML HTTP request object, so a specific object that you create to make a request, an HTTP request. Or to make things simpler, you could use a specialized library. And in our course, we recommend Axios, but it's essentially the same as an XML HTTP request. It just simplifies a lot. And this is essentially a summary of how it looks like with the XML HTTP request object. So you are in your browser in the upper left corner. Anything occurs, for example, the user clicks on a button. And that means in the background in your JavaScript, you create an XML HTTP request object. You give it the right parameters, for example, the resource to get, and then you send it off. And the rest goes essentially as a regular HTTP request. So it goes to the server processes it, creates a response and sends it back. And then in the browser, you have a method, for example, a callback function that processes the data and updates the page content. So for example, you could modify the DOM tree using the document.getElement by ID and then just change the content of the page. This is a code example of the classical XML HTTP request. So basically you create a request. First we go here. First you define the method. So we want a GET request here with a specific URI. So in this case, the camel's endpoint. And this argument in the end is actually your switch whether or not you want to do the synchronous or asynchronous. So if you do false here, it means that basically the website will freeze until you get a reply. And then you send it off. And the part up here is basically a definition of a callback function whenever the state changes of this object. So basically, XML HTTP request has 4 different states. So it's before you send it, while it's processing it, and so on. And 4 basically means you have gotten a reply. So in this case, whenever the state is 4 and we get 200 back, so an OK status, we just log the output. And that's basically all we do. But this means we can, in the background, create this object, do a GET request, and print the response or do whatever else we want with it. So this is the classical way of doing it, and that works fine. You can also do that in your assignment, but the negative thing here is that it's quite a lot of code, and you need to handle, for example, this ready state. You might need to set certain headers if you need them. So it requires quite a lot of things around. So one way to make this simpler is to use something that is called a library, a library to make AJAX requests, and one of them is Axios. There are others, for example, you might have heard of Fetch. But Axios is basically a library for making AJAX requests in a simple way, so it makes the whole process a bit simpler. And for this course specifically, it also works very well with Vue.js and is actually recommended by the creator of Vue. So this is an easy way of doing AJAX requests, and if you look at the updated template for assignment 2, you will also see that we use it there in the example. And the way Axios works is rather simple. You have an Axios object, and you can simply do .get, .post, .patch, and so on. So basically all the methods, all the HTTP request methods. And this is similar to what you do in the backend when you have the different routers. So what we basically do here is a GET request at API/camels. And then what is here, this code part, is actually called a promise. So this is something we have not discussed. And essentially it means it has a .then, which means this is the success case. If the request is successful, do whatever is in here. If not, that's the catch, do some error handling. So in this case, if I don't get any camels back, I empty the array and I print out the error. There is also, if you look in the assignment 2 template, you can have another then here, which basically means it's executed in any of those two cases. So this is similar to what you have in Java when you do a finally in a try-catch loop. And this is called a promise. Basically, this then catch casing. I won't go into details about this, but it's good that you have seen it and you roughly know what it is. But you can also create those objects yourself and do quite advanced error handling and case handling with them. The other thing that's a bit new here are so-called arrow functions. So here you see that there's arrow, that's a variable in this case, that our response has. And then you see this arrow and a code block. And this basically is a short form for function definition. So instead of writing function, open, close bracket, and so on, we just have this arrow and directly can do something. Of course, the negative thing is that we can't call this function from anywhere else. But as we just want to define it here, it's fine this way. Good, so this is how you do a AJAX request, both with regular JavaScript and with Axios. But there's one thing that is important to know and that you will probably encounter in the front-end assignment, and those are CrossOrigin requests. So if you do something like this, you do an AJAX request to google.com with, for example, post, asynchronous, then typically this request will be blocked. And the reason is that google.com and your front end, wherever you execute this command, are in different domains. So this is called a cross-origin request. So your origin, the origin of the request, is not the same as the destination, basically. And in most cases, those are declined, unless you have CORS enabled, which stands for cross-origin resource sharing. So basically allowing this to happen. And this requires both parties, so the client that sends the request and the server that receives it, to have certain headers set so that this works. So for this part here in this course, I only mention it, but it's important to know about it because you might run into trouble. If you, for example, have your backend deployed on Heroku, it's somewhere in the internet, and your front end you just open locally, and then you try to make a request, then it will be blocked unless you have the right settings. Good, so this is just a summary of AJAX and CORS, and I'll do a couple of smaller other things in more videos.